So in our person example, you could see that we're essentially going to launch Flask. So Jinja uses or is actually used along with Flask to organize data. And so what that simply does is pass on the frameworks to using a Flask. So these frameworks are we're going to be using where those tools, Jinja and Flask, work together essentially to then retrieve that data. We're also going to create our own list called dump. This is going to have some separate information we're going to pass on to JSON, which is another way to essentially encapsulate information. The reason why I use JSON is because it allows us to go back and forth with different kinds of templates. So we can, for instance, use Jinja, Flask, but we could also then use JavaScript more easily with JSON. So that's going to be another example of why we use that. So today's example is quite simple. We're just simply going to create some users, these people. So we can create a basic iteration in line 22, and then we're going to create some people. So we're all essentially going to just give them some information. They have email addresses, they have names, titles, that kind of information is going to go in there. So you can see that we get this information and we just basically provide them some data based on the number in which they are in a given range. Between 0 and 6. So the information will include department and image, which are basically just generic kind of placeholder kinds of information, but we can use for our example. And then we're going to append also an image to them, or apply an image to them. That image, as you'll see, there's nothing really exciting. It's basically a static looking sort of looking image. We're just going to pretend that's faces of people or some kind of symbol for a department in this case. Okay, so that's all it's going to do. And then in the next set of things, we will see this kind of render information where it will render the template. So that's where essentially Jinja and Flask take over, where they take the HTML layout. We give it a title page, a title name, which we call list of people. A secondary title, my data of people, and then we also have the option of using JSON within Flask's Jinja, and so we give it the users in this case, which we dump information on there, and then the users are the actual users of people. So this is just referencing another input that is used by Flask and Jinja to essentially represent information. Now it looks actually quite basic. The idea is that you're just moving data from code to the actual template. So if we look at layout template, we begin to see how that code is actually accessed. So most of the layout template is essentially looks like an HTML file. It has the kind of basic HTML structures, HTML tags. You have CSS tags as well. To add a little style, a color information perhaps, or other kinds of styling information. And then you have the HTML basics here, bodies, titles, metadata, all that kind of thing. And then you have different levels of titles, prints as well. We don't actually see the Flask Jinja application until we get to the UL tag. And so there you can see it's going to take inputs. It first has an if, so it's basically saying if users. So it's going to look for this list called users, which is the input that, if you recall, was one of the inputs we passed on to Flask and Jinja. And then it's going to get a person from users. So just like you would in Python, you get an object, essentially, or an item from a list. And you use that in the for loop, in this case, where you can get a specific item from a list. So a person from the list users. And then within that person, if you recall, we created a person object. So if you go to person.py, you can see the person object. He's instantiated. You can create him and give him all kinds of information. There's an image method that we also have. So that is also there. So all these things are actually there and that can be utilized. So if we go back to main, you can see that this is where we actually do the action. And then finally, after line 34, line 35, which does the actual layout call, all that does is basically tells the website where to look for the URL and sort of activates the web page based on the HTML layout. Now the server needs to be activated, and so that is done in the app.run method. So you're telling it to run with debugging as a flag to be true. So essentially what we do is activate Flask. We give it some information. as you can see here. We're going to then give it the layout, specify the layout that we're going to use, and pass that information to it, and then run the server, which will then make it active. And then going back to template, or layout in this case, we can see what happens there. We're simply going to iterate over the person, and then we're going to return specific information about that person. So the name, title, email, department, that kind of thing. And then we'll also get imagery, or images, the images being just that static looking image that we showed earlier. So it will reference the person's image in this case, and then get that as return. So image src is an HTML tag, but the HTML tag is talking to an object person which has an image reference. So we will be doing that in the example.